our next class in history. Our today's lesson is lesson number 6, Weavers, Iron Smelters and Factory Owners. We all know that India was very famous in the 17th century for its good quality of cloths and textiles. Surat in Gujarat on the west coast of India was one of the most important ports of Indian Ocean trade. The Dutch and the English trading ships began using the port at Surat from the early 17th century. Around 1750, before the British conquered Bengal, India was the world's largest producer of cotton textiles. Indian textiles were famous for its fine quality and extremely beautiful and delicate craftsmanship. These were extensively traded in Southeast Asia and West and Central Asia. European traders first found fine cotton cloth from India carried by Arab merchants in Mosul in present-day Iraq. So they began calling all the finely woven textiles as muslin. When the Portuguese first came to India in search of spices, they landed in Calicut in Kerala. The cotton textiles which they took back to Europe along with spices was called as calico, and this was the name generally given to the cotton textiles imported from India. Among the pieces which were ordered more were the printed cotton clothes called as CHINTZ, kosasas or khasa, and bandana. The word CHINTZ is derived from the Hindi word chint, which means a cloth with small and colorful flowery designs. From the 1680s, there started a craze for printed Indian cotton cloths in England and Europe for their floral or flowery design, fine texture and cheapness. Rich people of England, including the Queen herself, wore cloths of Indian fabric. The word bandana refers to any brightly colored printed scarf for the neck or head which was produced through a method of tying and dyeing. But the production of cotton textiles through machines in Britain during the Industrial Revolution had brought a huge decline in the demand of Indian textiles. And when British's iron and steel industry started growing from the 1850s, Britain came to be known as the workshop of the world. The industrialization of Britain had a close connection with the conquest and colonization of India. Earlier, company was buying goods in India and exporting them to England, and Europe was making huge profit through the sale of Indian textile. With the growth of industrial production, British industrialists began to see India as a vast market for their industrial products, and they manufactured cloths and began selling them. So cloths from Britain began flooding in India. The popularity of Indian textiles worried the wool and silk makers in England, and they began protesting against the import of Indian cotton textiles. In 1720, the British government enacted a legislation banning the use of printed cotton textiles, CHINTZ, in England. This act was known as the Calico Act. At this time, the textile industries was just beginning to develop in England. As these industries were unable to compete with Indian textiles in terms of quality and delicacy, English producers wanted a secure market within the country by stopping the entry of Indian textiles. Their first step was the calico printing industry. Indian designs were copied and printed in England on white plain, unbleached on Indian cloth. The invention of spinning jenny by John Kay in 1764 increased the productivity of traditional spindles, and the invention of steam engine by Richard Arkwright in 1786 revolutionized cotton textile weaving. This made it possible for the cloth to be woven in large quantities at cheaper rates. However, it was still not possible to stop the popularity of Indian cloths in the European market till the end of the 18th century. European trading countries like the Dutch, the French, and the English made enormous profits out of this growing trade. These companies purchased cotton and silk textiles in India through silver coins. But when Britishers got the Diwani of Bengal, they did not have to buy the Indian goods with the gold or silver they had taken from the British treasury. Now they collected revenues from peasants, zamindars in India, and used this revenue to buy Indian textiles. Weavers often belonged to communities that specialized in weaving. The first stage of production was spinning, a work done mostly by women. The charkha and the takli were household spinning instruments. The thread was spun on the charkha and rolled on the takli. When the spinning was over, the thread was woven into the cloth by the weaver. Weaving was done by men. For colored textiles, the thread was dyed by the dyer known as rangrez. For printed cloth, the weaver needed the help of specialist block printers known as chippigars. Handloom weaving and the occupations associated with it provided money and income for Indians. The decline of Indian textiles. The development of cotton industries in British affected textile production in India in several ways. Number one, the Indian textiles now had to compete with the British textiles in the European and American markets. Number two, due to heavy taxes imposed on Indian textiles, exporting of Indian textiles became increasingly difficult. With the start of the 19th century, English-made cotton textiles had successfully taken up all the Indian goods from the traditional markets in Africa, America, and Europe. Thousands of weavers lost their jobs. Bengal weavers were the worst hit. English and European companies stopped buying Indian goods, and their agents no longer gave out advances to weavers to secure supplies. Distressed weavers wrote petitions to the government to help them. By the 1830s, British cotton cloth came flooding into Indian markets. By the 1880s, two-thirds of the Indian population was wearing cotton cloth produced in Britain. This affected not only specialist weavers but also spinners. Thousands of rural women who made a living by spinning cotton thread had become jobless. Though machine-made cloths were famous, Sholapur in western India and Madurai in South India emerged as important new centers of weaving in the late 19th century. During the national movement, Mahatma Gandhi urged people to boycott imported textiles and use hand-spun, hand-woven cloth. Khadi gradually became a symbol of nationalism. The charkha came to represent India, and charkha was shown at the center of the tricolor flag of Indian National Congress adopted in 1931. The weavers who lost their jobs became agricultural laborers. Some migrated to cities in search of work, and some went out of the country to work in plantations in Africa and South America. Some of the handloom weavers also found work in the new cotton mills established in Bombay, Ahmedabad, Sholapur, Nagpur, and Kanpur. The first cotton mill in India was set up as a spinning mill in Bombay in 1854. Earlier, Bombay was exporting raw cotton to England and China. We all know that cotton grows well in black soil. The availability of black soil land helped the cottons to grow well, and which is why the cotton textiles mill came up where they had enough supply of raw materials. By 1900, over 84 mills started operating in Bombay. Many of these were established by Parsi and Gujarati businessmen who had made money through trade with China. The establishment of new cotton and textile mills gave job to thousands of poor peasants, artisans, and agricultural laborers who moved to the cities to work in the mills. In the initial or the starting years of the development, the textile industry in India faced a lot of problem. It found it difficult to compete with the cheap cloths which were imported from Britain. In most of the countries, governments supported the local mills by having a huge tax imposed on the cloths which were imported from other countries. In India, as it was a colonial period and Britishers wanted to promote their textile, it did not do anything in favor of the local industry. The first major development of cotton factories in producing textiles happened during the First World War, when textile imports from Britain had gone down very low. British wanted the Indian factories to produce cloth for military supplies. Our next topic is the development and decline of Indian iron and steel industry. The importance of Indian steel could be understood by the story of Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore, who ruled Mysore till 1799, fought 4 wars with the British and died fighting with a sword in his hand. Tipu's legendary swords are now a part of valuable collections in museums in England. The sword of Tipu Sultan was unbelievably hard and sharp, which could easily cut through the opponent's armor. The quality of the sword came from a special type of carbon steel called Wootz, which was produced all over South India. Wootz steel made into swords produced a very sharp edge with a flowering water pattern. Francis Buchanan has left us an account of the technique by which Wootz steel was produced in many hundreds of smelting furnaces in Mysore. In these furnaces, iron was mixed with charcoal and was put inside small clay pots. Through a complex system of controlling temperatures, the iron smelters produced blocks of steel that were used for making swords not just in India but in West and Central Asia too. Michael Faraday, the legendary scientist and discoverer of electricity and electromagnetism, spent 4 years studying the properties of Indian woods. However, the wood steel making process, which was so widely known in South India, was completely lost by the mid-19th century. Due to the conquest of Britishers over India, the swords and armor making industry was also affected by the imports of iron and steel from England. In spite of using a highly specialized technique of refining iron, villagers were forced to abandon furnaces and production of wood steel in Bihar and central India. Every district had iron smelters that used local deposits of ore to produce iron, which was widely used for the manufacture of implements and tools of daily use. The furnaces were most often built of clay and sun-dried bricks. The smelting was done by men, while women worked the bellows, pumping air that kept the charcoal burning. By the late 19th century, the craft of iron smelting declined. The reasons are: Number 1. The new forest laws did not allow villagers to get inside the forest to collect wood for charcoal. Number 2, because of the forest laws, the iron smelters could not get any iron ores from the forests. Even if the iron smelter had to enter the forest, the tax demanded from the iron smelters was too high, which is why many iron smelters left the jobs. Number 3. The import of British iron and steel reduced the demand of the iron and steel produced in India. In the year 1904, Charles Weld, an American geologist, and Dorabji Tata, the eldest son of Jamshedji Tata, were traveling in Chhattisgarh looking for sources of good iron ore to set up a modern iron and steel plant in India. Weld and Dorabji came upon a village and found a group of men and women carrying basket loads of iron ore. The people who were carrying the basket loads of iron ore were called as the Agarias. These Agarias told them that these iron ores were available in a hill. The Rajhara Hills had one of the finest ores in the world, but the problem was that the region was dry and water was essential for running a factory. A few years later, a large area of forest was cleared on the banks of the river Subarnarekha to set up the factory and an industrial township, Jamshedpur. The Tata Iron and Steel Company, shortly known as TISCO, began producing steel in 1912. TISCO was set up at the right time. All through the 19th century, India was importing steel that was manufactured in Britain. Expansion of railways in India had provided a huge market for rails that Britain produced. British experts in the Indian railways were not ready to believe that good quality of steel could be produced in India. By the time TISCO was set up, the situation was changing. In 1914, the First World War broke out. Steel produced in India now had to meet the demands of war in Europe. So imports of British steel declined dramatically and the Indian railways started getting supply of rails from TISCO. As the war dragged on for several years, TISCO had to produce shells and carriage wheels for the war. By 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by TISCO. With the passage of time, TISCO became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. Just like the cotton textiles, Indian iron and steel industry also expanded when British imports started declining and the market for Indian industrial goods increased. This happened during the First World War and after. Children, with that, I conclude this lesson.